I'd like to start off today by asking the question, do we as therapists actually care whether our therapies have any integrity, whether they're any good or not? Do we actually care about that? I'm not trying to say that as therapists we're lazy or don't give a damn or anything like that. I'm not suggesting anything of the kind. What I am suggesting is that they are very major structural reasons why we have to surrender our autonomy with regard to therapy. And I would also suggest that whenever we surrender our autonomy with regard to therapy, then it is no longer therapy. We've let go. It's something else. It's something else that's coming from beyond us that we have no say in. We just have to deliver, whether we believe in it or not. So that is therapy with no integrity. Even though probably an awful lot of people would not really see that as a valid point to make. But just to explain it a little bit more, years and years ago, the clinical director of the time sent every member of staff in the psych department instructions on how to deliver a CBT module. And he had kind of sussed it out that CBT is like a drugs regime. It has to be exact, it has to be recommended exactly the same for each person, and you have to stick to it. You don't make it up as you go along, you stick to the prescribing guidelines. Delivered immaculately true to the template in every case for every patient. And this, so our clinical director of the time assured us, would guarantee the very best results, the best possible results, because the individual nature of the therapist doesn't come into it then. It doesn't come into it even so much as a biomolecule or a hair's breadth. Obviously, if it's all about delivering a regime that's already been worked out by experts somewhere, supposedly, could be aliens, could be anybody, really, couldn't it? But in any event, so I'm absolutely sure, in as much as I can be absolutely sure of anything, which I can to a point, but that the clinical director did not see the outrageous nature of what he's suggesting. What he's suggesting is that the formal description of the therapy is everything, and the actual person or individual who's working with the client is completely irreplaceable, completely interchangeable. They don't figure at all. As long as you stick to the script, you're doing a good job as a therapist, which means you don't bring yourself into it. So the question is it possible to do meaningful therapy? Well, not that you can do therapy, but be a part of meaningful therapy if we don't bring anything of ourselves. And not only that, if we don't bring the whole of ourselves, because if the whole of ourselves is not in it, then there's no integrity there. The only integrity can ever come is if the only way integrity can ever come is if everything you say because you really genuinely mean it, not because you're reading a script. And the reason you mean it is because you understand it to be true as best you can. You could be wrong, but that doesn't matter particularly. What matters is that you're acting out of your truth. You're engaged with yourself. Otherwise, we're not engaged with ourselves. I might be engaged with the protocols of how to deliver the therapy, and that's where my attention goes, but I'm not engaged with my core, with the core of me, what that core of me, how is responding, because that's not part of the template. Anyway, so I'm taking an awful long time to make a very simple point, and the very simple point is therapy can never be something that's outside of us, that has been determined by someone else and that we deliver. It's like a conversation. It's very much like a conversation now that I come to think of it. If I'm having a conversation with you, or you're having a conversation with me, or both at the same time, and probably is how it usually works, then the conversation has to be authentic to me. I can't use a conversation that's been worked out in advance by some panel of some think tank somewhere that's got together to work out. I can do that, but if I do, it's totally inauthentic. It's not a conversation. I'm kind of being used as a transmitting device to transmit someone else's stuff, and that means that it's not coming from me. Someone else could transmit it just as well. Any transmitter would do. Anyone who can repeat the stuff. And all of this reflects, undoubtedly, something that is present in society, and that is a devaluation of the individual and an overvaluation of the protocols, the little recipes, the algorithms, the formulae, all that kind of stuff. All that kind of stuff which is dead kind of stuff, because I can assure you of one thing, to a certain extent anyway, I can assure you. If you are going through a crisis, a mental health crisis, no formulae, no algorithms, no crisp, clean and neat scientific protocols. It's going to make you feel in the least bit better. You might as well read the back of a cornflakes packet. The only thing that has a chance of genuinely helping is when you meet another human being, genuinely meet another human being, not a human being who's a mouthpiece for something or other that they're just passing on. And so this is turning into quite a long-winded kind of explanation, but of my initial point. But for me, speaking personally, I know that if I stick to what is been agreed upon as being best practice, and I write this down, and I write down what I'm doing scrupulously, and I do stick to best practice, then my parent organisation will stand over me in a legal way. So whatever happens, I can say, but best practice, and point to the manual. So that is a very the legalistic side of things is very strong in a big organisation. Essentially, no one wants me going out on a limb and kind of coming up with stuff myself, or being, God forbid, intuitive. Nobody wants that. So there is this very real pressure that I'm under to, if I am to have my organisation stand by me, which who knows, I might need one day, probably won't, but I might do, then I have to stick to the official guidelines. And if I don't, no one's going to back me up. Not that I will probably need backing up, but there is this inbuilt thing that we have to consider this, and we have to act from this kind of defensive posture of making sure that we can show that we did what we were supposed to do. So basically, there's a control hierarchy operating from on top down, and that control hierarchy via various mechanisms such as clinical supervision. Clinical supervision shouldn't really be plugged into a control hierarchy at all. That's an utterly appalling idea, but in practice it does tend to be. Which really nullifies the therapist and strips them of any autonomy at all, because who wants an autonomous therapist running around like some kind of a loose cannon? You know, in a big organization, you don't want that. And maybe there's legitimate reasons. You certainly don't want everyone coming in and making up stuff off the top of their heads and trying it out. You don't want that. But at the same time, you don't want to nullify and reduce all your therapists to mere ciphers, mere pawns. No human being is any good as a therapist if they're a pawn, just doing anything they can do. In this context, as I've said, or as I thought I said, possibly I said, it's all about authenticity and thinking what you're saying is coming from you, really. And it doesn't even matter necessarily that what you're saying, it's the authenticity of it. And authenticity doesn't come from anywhere else but apart from us. There's no guidelines on how to, for best practice as authenticity goes. It just means being true to yourself and having no other master. And that's taking responsibility. Otherwise, we can say, well, it's the rules. It always is the rules, isn't it? It's always the rules. Rules aren't therapeutic, though. Rules are good for machines because they help machines communicate one bit to another bit. They helps machines to do the mechanical things that they do because they're machines. And machines do mechanical things, and mechanical things always have to be based on rules because that's what mechanical things are. They're the acting out of rules. No flexibility there. So what I'm trying to say in a very long-winded way is that there is this very real structural problem in acting as an individual, wholly as an individual, not as a mouthpiece for an organization or for a profession, which is no good at all. Who wants to talk to a mouthpiece? But to be your own person. There's big structural problems there. And also there's other factors as well. It's very hard to go against a system, and if a system has decided that this therapeutic approach or these therapies are the ones, we can't say, well, I disagree with that. I don't want anything to do with it because I see it that to be based on a confused way of looking at things or a non-insightful way of looking at things. We have to buy into it. We don't have the power to change the system. The system, as everyone knows, the system overrides us. We don't override the system. And so that's systems eat up our autonomy anyway. So this, no matter which way it happens, we end up being compromised. Of course we're compromised. And what compromises it more than anything is the emphasis on being able to explain what we're doing in terms of what's already understood and having to write up stuff to show that you're sticking to these templates that have been laid down. And the problem, and this is something that I have been skirting around, but to come to it more directly, that the ultimate problem is that we believe that methods can help people heal, but that this kind of unique, therefore can never be repeated or replicated interaction between two human beings isn't so helpful or isn't such a crucial therapeutic ingredient, which of course it is. It all comes down to the absolutely unique and non-reproducible interaction between two people. But of course, that's no good at all when you're talking about systems, because how can you systematize that? You can't systematize that. So instead, you have a system and you systematize a system, which is a clearer way of what I was trying to say earlier. So the value of a system is that it can be systematized and checked up on and audited and rolled out and reproduced, etc., etc. That's the plus. That's it's the advantage there. Disadvantage is it's only for the sake of the system that the system feels that we feel good when we can systematize the system efficiently when we're rolling out the system. That is for the good of the system, it's not for the good of individuals. Nothing that is good for a system can be good for individuals. The two just don't go together. We have to choose. On the one hand, the individual, on the other hand, the system. By system, I mean something that's the same for everybody. It's a generic, reproducible kind of way of looking at things or way of doing things. And also that comes into training as well, because when we're training mental health professionals of whatever type, that's a systematic thing. And yet, simultaneously to this systematic training, there is another sort of learning going on, and that is the much more important is the learning that we obtain from our own lives and from our own experiences, which is tailor-made in a manner of speaking for us. It's not the same for you, but that's how I get wisdom, through my direct experience of things happening to me or not happening to me or whatever it is. That is the only way wisdom can be obtained. And that's interesting, because what we're looking at in training has nothing to do with wisdom. It's just information on how to do things. And in some cases that's great. In the case of mental health, I don't think it's so great, because this information about how to do things doesn't actually do anything, really, I don't think, for the reasons I've given, and also because what really does help is the genuineness, human contact. Human contact is always unique. Human contact is never generic or bureaucratized or systematized. So we have this tremendous conflict between the individual, as I keep on saying, and the system, and that's what compromises us as therapists. There's probably other things that compromise us as therapists. Our societal imprint of how we see the world and what we think life should be about hugely compromises us as well. I just thought of that. But that's a system. Society is a system, and the healthcare system is a system. So really, we're just talking about systems. When we're dealing with people, we're moving from the realm of statistics into the realm of individuals. Each person you meet is different. What is going to be helpful, or what is going to be heard, or what is going to happen depends on that individual. It's going to be different from someone else. So really, we're going into a territory that's completely, you have to have new eyes every time. You can't go into it with preconceptions of how it used to be, or what you might have learned in the past. So we have these two things anyway, if I can come back to the point. And the two things are wisdom versus received knowledge. And our society does not value wisdom at all. It doesn't trade in wisdom, it trades in expertise, obviously. But when we're going through a real crisis, mere expertise is insult to injury. We have a need at that particular point in time, a very great need, We don't know it maybe, but we do, and that's to meet a human being who has wisdom. All the traditional societies, of course, understood this. It's not too hard to understand. It kind of makes sense, but weirdly enough, within the context of the megaculture which has enveloped the whole planet, this doesn't make sense, because wisdom can't be systematized, and it's all about what can be systematized. So this big problem in the human race as a whole is that we've put all our money on systematization, which means expertise rather than wisdom. Wisdom is a naturally occurring kind of thing. We can't train anyone to be wisdom. It can't be outsourced, or there's no method to become wise. And on a smaller scale, so that's society as a whole, on a smaller scale, the healthcare organizations that we're part of have made the very same trade-off, experthood, because we can guarantee that we can weed out experts who aren't expert enough, and we can give the experts who are expert enough qualifications so that we know that they're expert enough, so we can regulate the whole system and audit the whole system, and the system can monitor itself, which is all very efficient. But the only problem is the ultimate commodity that we're getting, the commodity to be a very narrow expert who his or herself doesn't come into it, just the little expertise part comes into it. And that is profoundly, profoundly, profoundly unhelpful, untherapeutic. No one ever wants to meet a bloody expert when they're in a mental health crisis. Appalling waste of time, and makes you feel worse rather than better. To have someone who is genuinely wise and compassionate as well, the two do tend to go together. Just that contact alone has an incredible effect. It's not that the expert will do a thing to make you better, because that is kind of a fantasy. But somehow being able to be in the presence of someone who can accept the difficulty that you're going through and see it as part of a bigger picture of how the healing process works, or how life works, or nature works, is without actually fixing us, it changes the way we look at what we're going through so tremendously. So we need to be having a new way of looking at what we're going through, rather than clever ways of intervening and stopping what's happening from happening, going back to how we were before. It's not a small technical local fix we need, but the biggest thing that could ever happen to us in our lives ever, which is learning to see things in a new way, not just in the specifics, but the whole thing, learning to see life in a totally new way. Okay, thanks for watching.